The gloss is wearing off the government as the broken promises pile up, and it dawns on now inexperienced ministers that being in charge requires more than just photo ops and massaging the media. It's a common mistake for a newly minted minister to think they can actually get away with what I call political doublespeak. That's the term used to describe saying one thing when you actually mean another. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was exposed on this front this week. He told us recently that it was the Reserve Bank's decision to omit King Charles's image off the $5 note. But that wasn't quite true. You see, it turns out the government advised the Reserve Bank of its preference not to have the King appear after the Reserve Bank said it was actually the government's decision to make. Now, I know this is a seemingly small matter, but it's symptomatic of a government that thinks it can get away with almost anything. I mean, why else would they be targeting your savings that are held in your superannuation account? I understand. It's a honeypot of cash for any big spending government. But they'd leave it well alone if they actually thought there'd be a serious political price to pay for messing around with it. And let's remember, before the election, Labor promised no substantive changes to the super system. But this week, they announced a review that points towards a massive super shake-up, and it's highly unlikely you're going to be better off at the end of it. In fact, it's almost certain there'll be proposals for more restrictions, higher taxes, more government control of your money by the time this review is done. And then there's the Albanese cost of living crisis. Yes, it's his. He owns it. Labor have made things worse as they cover everything with their ideological web. There's no promised $275 saving on electricity anymore. Instead, there's going to be a massive jump in prices, made even worse than it would otherwise be by government policy decisions. And house prices are falling, but that's not delivering a more affordable housing sector. You see, because the cost of maintaining a mortgage is becoming impossible for many. Let me give you an example. When Labor came to power, a $1 million mortgage cost around $30,000 in interest every single year. Now, the same interest bill allows you to borrow less than half of that amount. How can Australians afford homes? And then how do falling house prices fit in with Labor's promised shared equity home ownership scheme? Do you remember that? It was a promise that the government said they'd go halves in the purchase price of your home and share in the spoils with you. Well, right now, it means more taxpayer losses, which is probably why we haven't heard a lot about it since the election. And then you've got the Prime Minister's platitudes and the fly-in, fly-out visit to troubled Alice Springs, among a number of other areas. There are reports, though, in Alice that the local troublemakers were rounded up and moved prior to the PM's 4-hour whistle-stop visit. Now, one can only assume it was to present a sanitised version of the outback town to the Prime Minister. It'd be terrible for him to see the consequences of his decisions. But 4 hours in a town in crisis? You'll likely spend longer than that at the gay Mardi Gras this weekend. And is it any surprise, really, that things in Alice Springs are heading back to the way they were? There's crime, looting and violence kicking off again. And the real problem is actually being kicked into the long grass for a photo op, while the government talks incessantly about something conceptual and means little to any of us, called the voice. Have you actually heard them say anything about the price of eggs or milk or meat? Have they made things easier for employers so more people can actually keep their jobs in tough economic times? And what have they done to strengthen our national defence or maintain an orderly and sustainable immigration system? In actual fact, they've dismantled one of the key border protection measures, and they've welcomed back 40,000 students from communist China, which of course will help make home rentals in our major cities even more unaffordable. It's becoming increasingly obvious that the government doesn't really care about how our lives are impacted by these substantive policy issues. Instead, they only seem to care about pushing their ideological framework into almost every aspect of our lives. They'll spin that lack of concern with soothing words about consulting and sustainability and so on. We also know that they won't tell the truth about even the smallest of things, which suggests they'll have no compunction if they need to lie about the big issues. Make no mistake, the honeymoon is well and truly over for the government. It's just unfortunate that we're the ones left with a hangover from their self-congratulations.